So, something that's really amazed me since starting this channel is the amount of support you've all shown me. What really blows my mind though is that a few people have even sent in donations. It's taken a while for me to get to these, and even longer to figure out how I wanted to show them off, but it's time for the first NCommander mail call, where we do a mini episode for each item that's been sent in, so without further ado, let's get right to it. So the first package comes from Fenord66 from soylentnews.org, and it's a bunch of floppy disks. In all seriousness, this, along with a second item he sent, were the first donations sent to this channel as a sort of getting started pack. While I've shown the DAWs 6 floppies and the Brief text editor before, the rest is new, so to speak. In short, we've got a full set of the legendary 90s compiler Borland C++, as well as a disk labeled DESQView. When I originally received this package, there were also some low-density disks that came along for the ride, but they're currently with a friend who needs them to reinstall a system. I'm not going to cover the DAWs floppies here since, well, I've used them in a ton of videos, but let's go through the rest. I actually don't know that much about Borland's development products, so this is more of an exploration and initial reaction sort of video instead of a more in-depth look. I'm going to get the ThinkPad out for this, which is still running Windows 95 fresh off the HP Dronata video. I'll start with Borland Brief, since, no pun intended, this will be brief. Brief is a full-screen text editor, and as I understand it, it was relatively popular in the pre-DAWs 5 days, since prior to that point, DAWs only shipped with Edlin. Installation is very straightforward with autoexec.bat and config.sys updated for me, although since this is a Windows 95 system, I did have to reboot by hand. This isn't the first time I've used Brief. It made a cameo back during the graphical file system video, and while I didn't find it that hard to use, it's not entirely intuitive either. For instance, I accidentally quit to desktop while trying to save a file. I know that Brief was sold as a standalone package, but I'm not certain if it was included with some versions of the Borland development tools as well. Still, it's a perfectly serviceable editor, and I'll probably use it on any system running early DAWs since it's a massive step up from Edlin. In short, it's a very welcome addition to my collection, and I expect that it'll make future appearances down the line. With the Brief appetizer taken care of, let's move on to the main course. Since people seem to get a kick out of me feeding floppies, I'll point the camera at the ThinkPad directly and hopefully, through the magic of DaVinci Resolve, make the passive matrix LCD actually look decent on camera. While I know a bit about Borland's tools by reputation, I never really used them, so this is pretty much all new to me. For those who aren't familiar with early DAWs development, Borland was essentially one of the kings, with its Turbo Pascal and Turbo C products dominating the low-cost market. Later on, they had specific products for DAWs, Windows, and OS2 combined with support libraries for those platforms. I had assumed that these product lines were entirely separate, but as it turns out, at least in Borland C++ 2.0, Windows support was included in the box. After examining the settings, it was just a matter of feeding the floppies and running through the install process. After installation, the README file was displayed and I found a few interesting tidbits of information. The Windows support included in the box is for Windows 3.0, and there's a special version of Turbo Debugger included for it. Afterwards, it's time for a reboot. After listening to the wonderful Windows startup chime, it's time to investigate a bit. No new icons were added to the start menu, but I had a heap of new utilities in the Borland C directory. BC opens the famous Borland C Ide. Since it's pretty much traditional at this point, I wrote out a quick Hello World program in C++. However, this is a pre-standard compiler, so there's no namespaces for one, and secondly, I have apparently forgotten that a new line is endout. After the necessary Googling, I got Hello World to build. Afterwards, it's now time to explore a bit more. Looking at the tools, I was a bit surprised to find what appears to be Microsoft's resource compiler instead of a Borland reimplementation. That, and a quick examination of Windows.h suggests that Borland indeed licensed at least parts of the official Windows SDK for this package. One thing I didn't find though was the famous Borland OWL. OWL, standing for Object Windows Library, was basically Borland's answer to Microsoft's Foundation classes and essentially existed in making Windows programming more tolerable. The missing OWL aside, there was your usual inclusion of various demo applications, and I was able to build a 16-bit Windows app without issue. However, Turbo Debugger for Windows was incredibly glitchy, likely due to the fact that 95 is far newer than what it was intended for. For one, the Windows cursor and the DAWS one are showing up at the same time, and I also noticed that when leaving Turbo Debugger, I had GDI corruption on screen. I may need to set up a period correct machine and just play with this a bit more. For this brief dive, I didn't do any debugging, but I do question how well this could have worked in practice. Until Windows 95, Windows used cooperative multitasking, which meant that any single application could crash the system, and the few times I've had to hook a debugger up to the 16-bit versions of Windows, it was always a two-machine affair. Early Windows development fascinates me, so this might be a good weekend project for a later date. Beyond that, I think that covers the penny tour of Borland C, and that brings us to the last disk in this set, DESQView. DESQView, made by Quarterdeck Software, is one of quite a few multitasking DAWS solutions and probably one of the more fondly remembered ones. Quarterdeck Software was essentially the premier line of DAWS enhancement tools, but its market share was eroded both by DR DAWS and Microsoft's own tools. While I was able to install DESQView under Windows 95, I had to drop to DAWS mode to actually use it. After loading it up, I get the DESQView menu and the ability to load applications. Multiple DAWS applications can be loaded side by side, so for instance, I can open up Edit, then QBasic, and then even overlay Brief on top. DESQView also supported macro recording and could even juggle the 16-bit versions of Windows if installed. All of this is done for the DESQView menu, which is accessed by pressing Alt by itself, and it had a relatively simple interface for managing and accessing applications. DESQView itself has a fascinating history with multiple revisions and rewrites, including an X11 compatible version known as DESQView X. I'm currently trying to track down a box copy of either DESQView or DESQView X for a more in-depth exploration in the future, and I especially want to compare it to IBM's Top View. Still, I think that will do it for a quick overview for now. Next up is the sealed copy of Microsoft's Visual C#, which is also from Finord 66. Visual C#, as the name might suggest, is a component of Microsoft's Visual Studio line of development tools, and was basically one of two introductory tools to programming for Microsoft's .NET environment. .NET could be best summed up as Microsoft's answer to Sun's Java runtime environment, and was also intended as a replacement for many of the legacy interfaces that had accumulated up to this point. It also helped remove dependency on the x86 architecture, since .NET code was compiled to bytecode and not to raw machine opcodes. This was seen as especially important since industry wisdom was that Intel's new 64-bit Itanium architecture would be the next big thing. While this future didn't quite come to pass, .NET is still a major cornerstone of Microsoft's product line. I do like collecting old development tools, and in this case, this box set will very likely be helpful when I make a video on .NET's predecessor, MSJVM and Visual J++. While it might be a while before I make that video, I was kind of excited to unbox this in its own right. This package was quite heavy, and I knew from experience that Microsoft generally included quite a few pack-in goodies, and on that note, I wasn't disappointed. At the top of this pile was this book providing an introduction to the C# programming environment. This wasn't too surprising since Microsoft had just released C# to the general public, and this would be an important first step to onboarding new developers. I flipped through it for a bit, and it seems to be a relatively good primer on the language. Continuing through the pile, next up is this quick start guide, which just outlines how to install Visual C#. There isn't that much to say about it, but one thing of note is that this version of Visual C# was also available on DVD. I had been under the impression that Microsoft didn't start using DVDs for software distribution until much later, but it appears that I was wrong on that account. Putting aside this quick start guide, we then come to this box labeled Visual Studio.NET Resources. Upon opening this box within a box, the first thing I spotted was the usual set of adverts for things like .NET Books and Crystal Reports. There was also this coupon for .Offuscator, which is a tool meant to help obfuscate and complicate reverse engineering .NET binaries. Those are pretty typical finds for these type of packages, but what I didn't expect were these giant posters. They appear to be a comprehensive API reference for the .NET environment subdivided by component. These posters are so large I couldn't unfold them properly at my desk. Instead, I had to lay them out on the floor to show you all. They honestly feel like something I'd see posted in a classroom. I'm not the biggest fan of programming in C#, so I don't think I'm going to hang these, but they're really neat regardless. Finally, we come to the last, but definitely not least important item, a hefty collection of CD-ROMs. The first one is the Visual C# installation disk, which, shouldn't be a surprise. The second one is, though, which is the strangely labeled Visual Studio.NET Prerequisites disk. Just saying the name alone is a bit of a mouthful, but there's a deeper meaning here that we'll explore in a little bit. Next up, we have the free CDs that represent an offline copy of Microsoft's .NET Msdn library. These are especially welcome because Microsoft has an extremely annoying tendency to delete old information off their website, and depressingly, these reference disks are often the last surviving documentation for legacy Microsoft products. I suppose there's a silver lining in that it's a lot easier to archive these than any potential dead tree documentation. Finally, rounding out the set, we have a pressed copy of Service Pack 4 for Windows 2000. There's not much else to say about it beyond that. With the last disk out of the way, the unboxing was complete and it was time to install. To that end, I decided to spin up a new Windows 2000 Professional VM. I generally have relatively fond memories of Windows 2000, and even now I still think it's a high point in Windows history. VirtualBox still supports Windows 2000 out of the box, and I was able to go through the installation process without a hitch. After installing the VirtualBox Edition CD, we're now ready to install the main event. Inserting the Visual C# disk brings up this installation wizard, which has 4 simple steps. Right out of the gate though, we're greeted with a warning that certain prerequisite components are missing. More specifically, it wants IIS and front page server extensions for web services development. I don't intend to explore web development in this video, but it's easy enough to install IIS to make the installer happy. After the requisite trip to add remove programs, we're prompted to install even more prerequisites. In this case, the installer wants that Visual Studio.NET prerequisites disk that I was talking about before. I'll let that install and then explain just what this disk is providing. Earlier versions of Visual Studio had each programming environment such as Fox Pro and Visual Basic be its own independent tool. The migration to .NET was Microsoft's first major effort in unifying all its tools into a common framework, which nowadays is referred to as the Visual Studio Shell. The idea was that you install the basic shell environment and then whichever Visual Studio products you owned, such as Visual C#. The shell environment was intended to provide a more consistent environment for developers, as well as allowing ISVs to create their own tools for extending Microsoft's products. In practice, this was not a smooth migration, and I strongly remember the Visual Studio environment being a fairly buggy mess until 2005. With that tangent aside, let's get back to the installation. As is the Microsoft tradition, the prerequisites disk required us to reboot the machine before we could continue. With all the grunt work out of the way, we're now ready to install Visual C# proper. This is a fairly anticlimactic process, which basically just involves inserting the disk and clicking through a few prompts. This is followed by the .NET Msdn library installation. It's rather impressive that the full documentation set eats up 1.9 gigabytes. I should note that this isn't even a full dump of Msdn, it's merely the C# components. The Msdn installation merely asks for all 3 disks, and then we're returned to the main 4-step wizard to install updates. Unfortunately, Microsoft's update servers have gone away in the 18 years since this box set was made. While I could hunt around for hot fixes and service packs, I think we can start playing with Visual C# as is. Jumping into the Start menu, we can see that we have Microsoft Visual Studio .NET 2003. If we had multiple Visual Studio products such as Visual Basic .NET installed, we'd be able to access them all through the Studio interface. This is why parts of the UI appear unnecessarily complex at first glance. Since we seem to be up and running, the next step is to create some Hello World programs, one graphical and one text-based. As to be expected, the console-based Hello World is pretty simple to say the least. It really is just a call to system console write line. After compilation, we can clearly see that everything is working. In contrast, a graphical Hello World environment is slightly more involved. By loading up the Windows application template, we get this drag and drop interface for creating UIs. This is what Microsoft calls WinForms, and it's their solution to enabling rapid prototyping of desktop applications. In many ways, this is essentially a reimplementation of the classic Visual Basic 6 environment. One thing that I did run into is that the Visual Studio interface was somewhat uncooperative, and I had some trouble placing down elements on the template. This was a fairly blunt reminder that 2003 was not a high point for Microsoft's development tools. I could have added more functionality, but it's a rather good showcase of how rapidly you could prototype an application's user interface. Now, I'm pretty sure that most of you watching would be curious if these binaries would work as is on modern versions of Windows. .NET took quite a long time to mature, and Microsoft's support for early versions of the framework was somewhat hit or miss. To be honest, I didn't actually expect this to work, but for the sake of science, I copied these binaries over to the Windows 10 installation on my laptop. I suppose it's to Microsoft's credit that these binaries work as is. I don't know if this is due to intentional backwards compatibility or if it's just an example of it works by accident. Finally, I will also note that I can run these binaries under Linux with Mono, but I do get a warning about the framework version. Maybe at a later date I'll look more in depth into stress testing .NET's backwards compatibility. While there's quite a bit more I could say about Visual C# and the .NET framework in general, I think this is a good enough overview for this mail call. As usual, if you like this content, please like and subscribe. If you really like this content, consider hitting that bell or perhaps even supporting me on Patreon. The overwhelming support for this channel has been amazing, and there are plenty more things that I hope to share with you all. It's on that note that this is NCommander signing out and wishing you all a pleasant day.